Some might say over-emotional. But that's the thing about sensitive people. If they get twisted up, they get meaner than everyone else. And that's what eventually happened to Bran. It was what his father had said. Isn't that weird? His father wasn't a bad guy. Didn't badger Bran about being overly sensitive. He himself was a cop and a man's man. But he'd never made Bran feel ashamed for being sensitive. Except that one little time with the stupid fucking snake. You need to toughen the fuck up. Maybe he'd had a bad day. Maybe he thought 6 years old was the cutoff for this type of behavior. Or maybe he just didn't think Bran would remember those indiscreet words. Parents make all kinds of mistakes, after all. Most of them are forgotten about in the wash of time. But some stick with you. That one stuck with Bran. You need to toughen the fuck up. And so he had. Or at least he'd tried. Problem was, he didn't really know what tough was. In his juvenile mind, tough meant not crying. But when everything always feels so big and scary, how do you stop yourself from being overwhelmed and devolving into tears? You get mad. Easier to get mad than deal with the real problems. Anger seemed to give him strength, made him powerful, made other people nervous around him instead of treating him like a little bitch. Anger and a propensity to take things too far so he could prove to them, and maybe to himself, that he was tough. So tough. So stupid. That was the seed that would eventually grow to be the thing he and Kat had called dark mode. But it didn't grow to its full potential until Bran was a teenager, and his dad died of a massive heart attack, and Bran had to be tougher than ever to keep from being overwhelmed by it all. Had to get angrier than ever. Had to be mean. And that's when he'd done the thing that, in retrospect, would alter the course of his life. That damn whiskey bottle. Clunk. That damn noise. Glass that he'd expected to break, and a skull that he'd thought wouldn't. Stupid, ignorant, misguided fuck that he was. Bran realized he'd been standing there on the north side of the monastery, not too far from the larder, just staring out at the dark woods. With the moon overhead, he could just make out the pale trunks of trees and the glimmer of their silvery leaves in a cool night breeze. He sighed out all the old, bad feelings of yesteryear. He was here now. And people could change, couldn't they? It took effort, but just because you'd gone down a bad road didn't mean you had to stay on it. You could find your way back to the good road. It just took a little bushwhacking to get there again. This place was good for him. Shay was good for him. Because if she didn't have the rule that she had, or if Bran had wound up in another settlement of people, he knew he'd just end up right in the same place, toting a gun, looking for threats, never at peace. This was better. This was feeling like the good road. He started to turn and finish up his rounds, but a noise made him freeze. He couldn't have said what it was. Maybe the wind in the trees, or maybe something moving through the woods, but it sent icy spiders crawling up and down his spine. He stared at the woods, eyes wide, trying to let in more light, ears pricked for another sound, the sounds of crickets and frogs and night birds fading into the background as he focused through them. He glanced to his left. The door to the larder was only 10 strides away. He could make it there in a flash, eyes darting back to the woods. Pale trunks, moonlit leaves. A very distinct noise this time, like something hefty thudding to the forest floor. Adrenaline hit him hard, pulse spiking, nostrils flaring. Fuck, he breathed, not daring to take his eyes off the woods now, but slowly sidestepping towards the larder door. Something moved on the tree line, or at least he thought something moved. It was all inky shadows. How the hell could he see movement? But he stared at the spot it had come from and could have sworn that, where there had only been the pale trunks of the trees in the moonlight only seconds before, there was now a large black shadow. He froze again, caught in a moment of indecision. Should he run for the larder door? Start yelling? Wait to see if something moved again? The longer he stared at that shadow, the longer he began to think maybe he'd just imagined it. Agonizingly slow, he sidestepped again. Maybe it was just his own shifting perspective, but he could have sworn the shadow moved by a small degree. So he froze yet again, now breathing hard through his mouth. Raise the alarm? But what good would it do? Well, if it was primals out there, they could at least lock the doors. They were pretty heavy things. He had no doubt that the primals could break their way in eventually, but maybe they'd give up before it came to that. They could be pretty distractible. He didn't know how long he stayed locked in place, staring at that shadow. But the longer he stared at it, without any further signs of movement, the more he started to doubt his own senses. Shadows and moonlight and breezes in the trees could make you see and hear all kinds of things. He hazarded another glance towards the larder door, and when he looked back, he couldn't find the shadowy shape again. Keyed up, Bran told himself, feeling a little ashamed. Just too damn keyed up. Bran awoke at first light the next morning to the somewhat disconcerting image of Kat's face hanging over him. "Bran," she whispered the second his eyes opened. His head recoiled into his pillow for a moment until his thoughts clarified. He knew Kat's face, and when he was fully conscious, it didn't bother him in the least. But coming out of a hazy dream space, it was still a rude awakening. "What?" he croaked, a bit piqued. "A body," she said. "In the woods." Bran was out of bed in a flash, his mind immediately going back to the previous night and the things he'd thought he'd seen and heard. But no, he'd just imagined that, hadn't he? He yanked on pants, stepped into his boots, and off they went, pausing only long enough to wake Shay, who reacted in much the same way as Bran, wordlessly dressing in a flash. Then they followed Kat. By the time Kat led them through the larder and out the back of the monastery, Bran was starting to think maybe he hadn't imagined those things last night. And then she was leading them through the harvested field of corn right to the spot where he'd heard the noise, where he'd seen the shadow. And he started to get a real hinky feeling. 2 strides into the woods, there she lay. A female, and a hybrid, Bran was almost certain. Flies buzzed around the body, crawling over the eyes and in and out of the gaping, inhuman mouth. The body lay on her back, arms and legs splayed, looking almost like it had been posed. Dark patches of dried blood all across her tanned chest, and more of it down near her pelvis, crusting the dark thatch of pubic hair. She'd had her throat ripped out. That much was obvious. But what was worse was what had been done to her pelvis. The belly had been ripped open just above her pubic bone. Something had been pulled out of her and now lay in a clotted pile between her thighs. Bran was no anatomy whiz, but he was pretty sure he knew what it was. Something ripped her uterus out. Bran, Kat, and Shay standing there, staring down at the mess, none of them speaking. Bran glanced to his right, where Kat stood. She didn't seem particularly disturbed. Her eyes were hard, peering all through the woods, as though looking for sign that only she could see. Then he looked to his left. Shay stood with one hand over her mouth, her eyes wide, but the bottom lids tensed, a line of tears glimmering there. It was disturbing, yes, but the look on Shay's face was like she'd known this hybrid female. And that was what hit Bran like a punch to the gut. "Shay?" he asked, his voice a little strained. "Is that—" Slowly, Shay nodded, never taking her hand off her mouth. "Yes," she whispered. "That's Queen Bee." Chapter 11. It had happened again. 4 days after Patrick's run-in with the possibly imaginary Big Black on the side of the road, Ambush Alley had claimed another victim. Or several victims, really. Patrick's mind was a mess as his team's little pickup cleared the last curve and entered into Ambush Alley. Down the long straightaway, he could see the vehicles of the caravan that had been hit. The caravan that Hugo had been riding bitch patrol on. I know what I fucking saw, and I saw Big Black. Except, when it had come right down to it, he'd been too much of a coward to stick with his conviction. He'd let doubts overtake his mind and poison his trust in himself. And then he'd been even more of a coward and not mentioned it to anyone outside of his team, fearing their respect for him would wane if they knew about his mistake. Except that it hadn't been a mistake, had it? because that was just too much of a damn coincidence. He'd spotted Big Black. He knew what he'd seen, goddammit. But he'd failed to stick to his guns, and now this had happened. If he'd only been surer of himself, if he'd only been less of a coward, less worried about what people might think of him, then he might have prevented this. As Patrick and his team approached the caravan, he saw that there were 2 humans left standing. His eyes jagged between both of them, hoping against hope. But no, neither of them was Hugo. Behind Patrick's pickup followed another 4 vehicles, all of them crammed full of a security force from Winchuck. Patrick and his team had been in Winchuck all day, doing a security sweep of those damn wheat fields again, because more sign had been discovered there. They'd gone over the edge of the wheat field again and again, but found nothing. 15 minutes into the 30-minute drive between settlements, Hugo had sent out a radio transmission, his voice oddly calm amid the background noise of gunfire and screams. "We got hit. Ambush alley. Need help." It sounded like he'd intended to say more, but then there was just a flurry of close-up gunshots, possibly Hugo himself firing wildly as he still transmitted, and then the transmission had ended. No one had responded to Patrick's innumerable hails after that, as his team and the squad of 20 security men and women from Winchuck hauled ass out there. Warren was in the driver's seat, and the second that he shoved the shifter into park, Patrick exploded out of the passenger side. They'd come from Winchuck, and the caravan had been coming from O'Brien, so the column of vehicles was facing Patrick. Between him and them was a felled tree right across the road. Too big to be any of the ones that actually grew on the side of the road. Those were all new-growth saplings. No, this was an already dead and fallen tree that someone had muscled into the middle of the road. The infected had created a roadblock in order to ambush the caravan. It was not beyond Patrick's ability to believe. He'd never seen them use this particular tactic before, but they were clever enough. He wouldn't put it past them. And Big Black? Oh, he was the cleverest son of a bitch of them all. You saw him, and you didn't say anything, and now this happened. "Hugo!" Patrick belted out as he stepped over the trunk of the tree in the road. The 2 survivors were already hustling over. They looked scared out of their minds. And relieved, like Patrick was their salvation. He barged right through the middle of them as they let out a torrent of information that Patrick could have put together himself. They'd been driving along, almost hit the downed tree, and as soon as they'd stopped, they'd been attacked. Infected, coming from both sides. It all happened so fast. "Hugo!" Patrick shouted again, eyes ripping across the ambushed caravan and then to the bodies all over the ground. Ignored by Patrick, the 2 survivors barely even paused to take a breath, but just started repeating themselves to Patrick's team as they followed him. But they ignored the survivors as well. 7 bodies, Patrick counted. 5 of them were infected, riddled with bullet holes. 2 of them were people. One had her head ripped off her shoulders. The other was a man that looked like his chest cavity had been pulled open like a clamshell. He wasn't Hugo either. 2 thoughts chasing each other like squirrels around a tree trunk. This was Big Black. It had to be him. And, for fuck's sake, where's Hugo? Patrick made his way around the entire caravan, checking the insides of the vehicles and the brush-choked shoulders of the road. Every single vehicle had every single door hanging open. None of them had bodies inside. Some of the interiors were splashed with blood. 2 of the vehicles had broken windows. When he got all the way back to the felled tree, he marched right up to where the 2 survivors were now yammering the same bullshit to the security force from Winchuck. He barged into their midst. "Where's Hugo?" he demanded. "What happened to him?" He posed the question to both survivors, who were standing shoulder to shoulder with wide, bewildered eyes. One simply stared, slack-jawed. The other seemed to have just a few more operating brain cells. "He was..." Lips quivering silently for a beat. "They took him." Something opened up in the bottom of Patrick's chest, and he felt things rising, threatening to paralyze him, threatening to take his knees out from under him. Instead of letting them overwhelm him, he got mad. "Who the fuck was driving this lead vehicle?" he shouted at the 2 survivors. The one that had seemed robbed of words now raised his hand. I was driving the lead vehicle." Incensed beyond the ability to control himself now, Patrick lurched forward and grabbed the man by the scruff of his neck. A couple of shouts from the Winchuck folks telling him to back off and calm down, But when they tried to intervene, Ace and Wendell stopped them. Patrick shoved the survivor's face towards one side of the road, then the other. "You see that fucking shoulder? You see that brush to either side of it? All those fucking saplings and shit?" "Yeah?" the man mewled. Patrick shook him, screaming in his face. "You can drive through that shit!" Still shaking him violently. "Why the fuck didn't you drive around? Why'd you stop? What the fuck were you thinking?" I... With his mouth close to the other man's ear, like he was trying to blow his eardrums out with the force of his yelling. "You don't fucking stop for a downed tree in Ambush Alley!" Patrick had been over-focused in his rage and hadn't noticed that Ace and Wendell had been shoved to the side. 5 of the Winchuck security force aggressed on Patrick, headed by their leader. Patrick was roughly parted from the man he'd been shaking and screaming at. He immediately turned his ire on the security leader, a man named Judd. They batted hands, then shoved chests, both hollering and neither hearing the other's words, until Patrick reestablished a modicum of control over himself and realized he was being a complete cock. Then he registered the man's words. "Don't you fucking blame him for this shit!" Judd was barking in his face, veins standing out in his neck. "You and your team have one fucking job!" Ah, there it was. The mention of their one fucking job. "It's your job to keep the roots safe," Judd continued on. "So if you want to blame someone for this going down, how about you blame your own damn self?" By now, Ace and Wendell had reasserted themselves, a lot of calming hand gestures, their palms on both Judd and Patrick's chests, keeping them separated. Warren and Jimmy were there too, scowling at the rest of the security force. Shame and anger washed over Patrick in equal measures. He took a moment to breathe. God, but he was shaking all over. "I do blame myself," he seethed at Judd. "Don't you worry about that." And then, remembering he had a fucking job to do, Patrick closed his eyes for a second, centered himself, then opened his eyes again. "Secure the vehicles," he said, much calmer. "And get the meat out of the road. Take 'em back to Winchuck and burn the infected and bury your dead." Judd glared at him, but didn't object. "What are you gonna be doing?" "My one fucking job," Patrick snapped. Then he turned to the idiot that hadn't driven through the ambush like he should have. "What direction did they leave off in?" The man, still looking shaken up, pointed a trembling finger north. "They went that way. They take anyone alive?" "I don't know," the man said lamely. "I wasn't paying attention." Patrick narrowed his eyes at him. "Any women in this caravan besides the one with her head pulled off?" Maybe he should have been more sensitive. Maybe the guy had been close to her, or maybe it just disturbed him. His eyes very suddenly welled with tears and his face contorted. "That was Stacy," he whimpered. "And there was Tia. I don't know what happened to her." Well, Patrick could guess. He hadn't seen any other human bodies aside from the 2 dead ones and the 2 live ones. There had to have been at least 8. All vehicles in a caravan were required to have at least a driver and a gunner. Possibly there were more. The men would have been killed before they were carted off for food. But when the circumstances allowed it, the infected would take the females alive, immobilized, usually by breaking their legs and dislocating their shoulders. Patrick said nothing else, but just spun and moved towards the northern side of the road, his team falling in behind him. "I'll take point. Wedge formation. Once we find the track, we're moving as fast as I can keep it. Ace, take right flank. Wendell, left flank." He didn't really care how Warren and Jimmy positioned themselves. He just wanted Ace and Wendell with their high-capacity carbines on the wings. "Pat," Warren said in a distinct tone that meant he wanted a quiet conference. Patrick gritted his teeth and stopped, just inside the brush on the north side of the road. "What is it?" he said, his voice flat as he scanned for the start of a trail. "There's just the 5 of us." "I can count." "You sure about that?" Warren shot back. Patrick looked at him, getting pissed all over again, but knowing he wasn't going to turn that on one of his teammates. Warren jerked his head towards the convoy. "We got at least 5 missing bodies. 4 from the caravan plus Hugo. There might have been more taken, which means that pack of infected is at least as numerous as we are. I don't like even odds with these things, man. And I know you're pissed off and ready to go, but we should double up. Bare minimum." A significant look. "Especially if you're thinking this was Big Black." People like to think of themselves as rational, but they're not. These types of decisions happened all the time, and handling them logically was the exception, not the rule. Most human beings made decisions based on emotion. Patrick also liked to consider himself a rational person, but he was not an exception as much as he liked to think he was. And in that moment, faced with a fork in the road of his life, a decision that would have monumental consequences for him and his team, all Patrick could think about was the fact that if he requested additional manpower for their hunt, he knew damn well that Judd was going to be one of them. He didn't want that asshat anywhere near him right then. And so, as human beings are wont to do, Patrick made an emotional decision and then tried to rationalize it with some fuzzy logic. "Those idiots don't know how to track," Patrick growled. "Best case scenario, they slow us down. Time that Tia can't afford to lose, if she's even still alive. Worst case scenario, they keep up by crashing through the brush like a herd of elephants and Big Black hears us coming. He and the rest of his infected are going to be drowsy after feeding. Our advantage is surprise, which Judd and his fucktards will destroy if we let them come along." Warren had an odd look on his face, like he wanted to argue but felt that Patrick couldn't handle it. "Christ, Patrick," Warren breathed. "At least tell Judd to monitor the base station in case we need backup." "Fine." Patrick turned, cupping a hand over his mouth to shout, "Judd! Monitor the base station in case we need backup!" Judd acknowledged this with a withering glare and a yeah. Patrick arched his eyebrows at Warren. "There. Happy?" Warren's face screwed up. "Hell no, I'm not happy." "Me neither," Patrick snapped. "Let's roll." Chapter 12. "You've been real quiet today," Bran observed, walking beside Shay as they made their way through the twilight shadows of the corridor, heading towards Elijah's dormitory room. Fact was, she hadn't said a damn word since she'd confirmed that the body in the woods was Queen Bee earlier that same morning. Silence as they buried her deep underneath the compost pile. Shay hadn't directed them there, simply taken a shovel from the monastery's gardening shed and then gone over to it and started digging. Bran had taken a shovel as well and helped, thinking that composting the dead hybrid was weird but also pretty pragmatic. Shay didn't even say the blessing at dinner, just went about eating, staring at the middle of the table as though one of the knotholes in the wood grain were a portal to another dimension. She took her food like it had no flavor, her movements robotic. Then she'd made up a plate for Elijah, if he was actually awake to eat it, and headed off. Well, Bran had been there for about 2 weeks now, and he'd grown more comfortable with Shay, and she with him. She hadn't threatened to kick them out recently. Bran thought that she was getting used to having him around. Another adult to talk to, which she did often, today notwithstanding. Carrying Elijah's plate in both hands and walking at a sort of slow, tired pace, she looked at Bran when he made his observation on her silence. Not much emotion behind those dark eyes. Bran just wanted to get her talking. Hell, he'd even be glad if she got mad at him. This silence was starting to freak him out a bit. "It's just," Bran pressed on. "I mean, I know you were familiar with Queen Bee, but I never got the sense that you had much affection for her. So why does it seem like you're so torn up about her dying?" They stopped in front of Elijah's door. Shay stared down at the plate in her hands, opened her mouth, but then closed it again and went through the door. With a disgruntled sigh, Bran followed. Elijah stirred when they entered, sat up in his bed looking groggy. They'd been right about him. He was strong and improving rapidly every day. Shay had taken the drain tube out the previous day and sewed the incision shut. Both the incision and the bullet wounds were red and inflamed, but Elijah's powerful constitution prevented the infection from really taking hold. So far. His lungs were still a little wheezy sounding, but otherwise he seemed able to breathe fully without too much pain. Or maybe he just hit it well. Shay went to the side of the bed and said her first words since that morning. "How you feeling?" "Better," Elijah rasped. "When can I get up?" Shay didn't answer, but pushed the plate of food towards him. "You hungry?" He nodded. "Then I'll tell you what," Shay said, laying the plate in his lap.
If you eat your whole meal, I'll think about letting you go for a walk in the morning. See how you do. Then we'll reevaluate from there."
Elijah nodded again and set about eating, though it lacked his usual gusto. Shay watched him for a time with a slight, sad smile on her lips. She pointed to his nightstand where a tallow candle stood.
"You want the candle lit? Maybe do some reading?"
Elijah shook his head, giving the stack of papers next to the candle a scornful look. The monastery had a definite dearth of reading materials fit for someone just learning how to string sentences together, so Shay had made her own versions of beginning reader books, complete with illustrations. She was no artist, but the pictures were legible enough to match up to the simple sentences below them. See-spot run type of stuff.
"Still tired," he grunted. "More sleep."
"Okay,"
was all Shay said, running a hand over his matted hair. Then she turned and left the room with Bran in tow. Closing the door behind her, Shay leaned a shoulder on the jamb and arched an eyebrow.
"Bran,"
she said quietly.
"Yeah?"
"Do you like tequila?"
Bran was surprised and also uncertain.
Fuck yeah, I do."
She gave him a bare smile and shoved away from the door.
"Come on."
She led him to her dormitory room, lit the candle on her nightstand with a box of matches that looked like it was getting perilously low. Then she went to the simple wooden dresser against the wall and opened one of the top drawers, reached in and pulled something out of the back. Bran could hardly believe his eyes. It was a genuine, unopened bottle of Jose Cuervo's silver.
"No way,"
he said. She sauntered back to the bed, looking at the bottle.
"Yes way. I found it in one of these dormitory rooms when I first searched the place over. Not sure which monk was hiding this shit, but God bless him for it."
She took a seat on the edge of her bed, and Bran grabbed the chair and moved it over to her, sinking down into it.
"You haven't opened it yet?"
Bran was incredulous.
"You've had it for 4 years, and never in all that time did you have a day where you needed a fucking drink?"
Shay shrugged and twisted the cap to the delightful sounds of a snapping seal.
"No, I had plenty of bad days. Just was never much of a drinker in the first place. Besides, not like we're ever going to see a real bottle of tequila again. I guess I was saving it for a special occasion, or maybe as a bartering item."
"So, are you about to barter with me for something?" Bran said, squinting. "Or is there a special occasion I'm not aware of?"
Another shrug, Shay staring at the clear liquid within.
"We'll call it a wake."
Then she raised the bottle.
"To Queen Bee."
She seemed like maybe she had something to add, but then thought better of it and simply took a swig, winced hard as she swallowed, then shuddered, passed the bottle. Bran could have chugged it like water. Wanted to, quite badly. But he didn't want to be rude, and like Shay had said, when were they ever going to see a real bottle of tequila again? Probably never. So he took a measured sip. It was everything he remembered. He realized belatedly that he hadn't toasted Queen Bee, but decided that was fine. He wasn't terribly inclined to honor the creature that had treated Shay like a pet and let her get raped by the alpha male she called Khan. He passed the bottle back. Shay held on to it without drinking.
"I'm not torn up about Queen Bee dying."
Bran folded his hands in his lap and gave her space to talk.
"It's just what Khan did. I know it was him. It's the only thing that makes sense."
Her eyes met Bran's, haunted.
"He was sending a message. To me, to my boys. And what he did to her, tearing her."
She trailed off, shoulders tensing. Then she abruptly took a sizable slug from the bottle. Another shudder, but no cringe this time.
"Maybe he was showing me what he planned to do with me."
"Hey, come on."
Bran reached out and took one of Shay's hands in his.
"He hasn't shown up yet. You don't know if it was even him that left her out there."
Though, as Bran said it, he remembered the big, dark shadow at the edge of those woods the previous night.
"And Elijah will be back on his feet in no time."
Shay didn't respond to that, just offered Bran the bottle again. He took a bigger swallow this time, then handed it back.
"I should probably stop there. A bit of a lightweight after not having it for so long, and I got watch in a few hours."
Shay nodded, then released his hand and slowly laid back on the bed, looking stiff and not at all comfortable. Bran figured that was his cue to leave, so he made to stand. Her hand went out, touching his knee and halting him. Shay looked at him plaintively.
Will you stay? Just until I fall asleep?
She looked briefly sheepish.
It'll help me relax.
Bran felt a warmth come over him, some long untended aspect of himself that woke up at that simple request and was overjoyed. Someone needed him? Someone actually felt more relaxed around him? Amazing things happen when you're not toting a gun and murdering folks. Who'd have thunk it? Yeah, he said softly, easing back into his seat again. Of course. Shay withdrew her hand from his knee.
Thank you.
She folded her hands across her stomach and closed her eyes, looked eerily like a corpse in a coffin. You want me to blow that candle out? Bran asked, before she could drift off too much.
No,
she murmured, exhaustion heavy in her voice.
Leave it burning.
Bran awoke with a soft snort. Golden candlelight. Shay rolled onto her side, her back to him and her blanket pulled up over her shoulders. The night air coming in through the open window above her bed was surprisingly cool for late summer. It smelled faintly of rain, like there'd been a light shower recently. Bran frowned, having that vague feeling that something had woken him up, but not really able to say what it was. God, he must have been more tired than he thought, falling asleep in the chair like that. A glance at the pool of melted tallow in the candle told him he must have been out for at least a couple hours. Shit, he'd need to be on watch pretty soon then. The only official timekeeping device in the monastery was a mantel clock that Shay kept on her dresser. Bran twisted to peer at it by the dim glow of the candle. After a moment of blinking the fogginess out of his eyes, he registered where the hands were pointing. 10 minutes to midnight. So he had another hour before he needed to relieve Shad on watch. He toyed with whether or not he'd even get himself back to sleep. If he got up and went to his room, by the time he got there, he knew he'd be too awake to fall back asleep. Maybe he should just doze off in the chair by Shay's bedside for the next hour. A faint sound. The patter of a soft rain on the monastery's tin roof. Sucks for Shad, Bran thought, and then got a little disgruntled at the thought that it might still be raining in an hour when his turn came. But then the rain stopped, quite abruptly, and something about it. It started up a breath later, harder and faster than before, a weird rhythm to it. Almost like... Bran stood up, staring at the open window through which the soft sound was coming. That wasn't rain, he realized, as his heart and stomach parted company, one rising, the other falling. That was the sound of distant gunfire. The rhythm of it was unmistakable to Bran. He was, unfortunately, intimately familiar with what a gunfight sounded like. The hectic chatter, vaguely punctuated by something a bit heavier going off at a slower pace. He slid into the narrow gap between Shay's bedside and her nightstand, his face peering into the darkness outside of the window. Hard to tell without light, but he was pretty sure it wasn't raining currently, though the sill was wet. The distant gunpowder argument seemed to reach a crescendo and then abruptly died. He glanced at Shay again, but she hadn't stirred. 2 more muted pops, and then nothing. He stood by the window for the better part of a minute, waiting for the gunfire to resume. But whatever was happening out there seemed to have been permanently decided. But where was it coming from? He couldn't determine the direction just from hearing it through the window. Shad would have heard it, though, and since he was presumably outside, he might have a better sense of the direction. Bran peeled himself away from the window and stalked quietly out of the room, easing the door shut behind him. There was that temptation, after sensing something so dimly, to doubt whether he'd sensed it at all. Kind of like he'd done with that big dark shadow at the woodline. But he hadn't imagined that, had he? And he sure as shit hadn't imagined that gunfire. The air was cool and humid, heavy. How far could the sound of gunfire carry on a night like tonight? A few miles, maybe? Probably not much further than that, which meant it couldn't have come from either of the settlements linked by that trading road to the south. Bran had gotten the sense that they were pretty far apart, with nothing but wilderness between, since the guy that had come after Elijah hadn't even been aware that the monastery was here. So who the fuck was traipsing around in the wilderness at night? It was almost unthinkable. Normal people from normal settlements buttoned up after dark. The primals weren't strictly nocturnal, but they did a good bit of their hunting at night, and no one wanted to be on the menu. So what group of idiots had decided on a nighttime stroll through primal-infested woods? He made his way through the courtyard garden and out to the main entrance of the monastery. Once he felt he was far enough away from the dormitories to not disturb anyone, he belted out a harsh whisper. "Shad!" Waited. Interminable seconds ticking by. Uncertainty curdling into fear. Christ, Shad hadn't wandered off into the woods himself, had he? Surely he wouldn't be so stupid to light off after the gunfire. Yeah, he was only 2 years old and still pretty ignorant, but the triplets all seemed to be at least pretty savvy. His mounting concern was relieved by the sound of soft, rapid footsteps swishing through the wet grass. Wet, not just from dew. It had definitely rained, reminding Bran that his old boots weren't watertight anymore. His socks were already soaking through, the ground squishy beneath the cracked soles. Bran searched the darkness with eyes mostly adjusted. No moon due to the cloud cover, but he spotted the shape coming around the corner of the monastery to Bran's left, coming from the east side. It was walking upright, so Bran's immediate fear that he might be about to get chomped on by a primal was allayed. "Shad?" Bran hissed again. "Yes," came the raspy voice. Bran stalked out and met the kid, who looked more like a young adult. "Did you hear that gunfire?" Shad's face was a mask of shadows, but Bran saw the way his head tilted to one side. "Yes." "Could you tell where it was coming from?" "Yes." Bran waited for a few beats, then impatiently pedaled his hands over each other. "Well, fucking tell me then. Which direction was it coming from?" Shad turned around as though orienting himself, then raised a barely visible arm and pointed in the general direction of east. "That way." Bran chewed his lip, thinking furiously. The primals, and the hybrids, had far superior senses than regular humans, which included hearing. And that made him wonder, "Shad, did you hear anything else besides the gunshots?" Shad turned back to face him. "Men. Screaming." "Shit," Bran whispered. "Screaming like yelling at each other? Or screaming like screaming?" Shad reiterated. "Like dying." Well, that about figured, but it still tied Bran's insides in uncomfortable knots. He hissed out a disconsolate breath, trying to think of what to do. Did he need to do anything? This didn't really involve them, did it? No, probably not, except simply by its proximity. Nowadays, it paid to be paranoid. Bran needed to assume something bad was coming their direction. But what to do about that? They had no way to defend themselves. They could only hide and hope. Bran realized he was staring at Shad. What to do with this kid? Because he was a kid, evidence to the contrary be damned. He might have been stronger than Bran and had better senses, but still a kid. One of Shay's boys. And Bran didn't even want to imagine the wrath that would come down on him if he left any of Shay's boys in a potentially dangerous situation. "All right, Shad." Bran made up his mind, reaching out and grabbing the kid by his muscular shoulder. "I want you to go to your mother's room. Lock the door behind you. Wake your mother and tell her that—" Bran trailed off, wondering what exactly he wanted Shad to say, and also how much instruction Shad could actually retain. "Just tell her we heard some gunshots, but I'm keeping watch. Tell her to stay locked in until I tell her it's safe. You got all that? Can you remember all that?" Shad let out a soft chuff, as though offended by the implication that he couldn't, and said, "Yeah," in an oddly snarky and teenagerish tone. Bran frowned at the kid, though he knew his expression couldn't be seen in the dark. Or maybe it could. Hybrids could see quite well in the dark. "All right, well, fuck off then," Bran growled. "Get going." One great thing about hybrids that Bran had noticed? They didn't offend easily. Shad grunted and slipped around Bran, padding softly through the monastery's entrance and disappearing in the gloom. Bran stood there for a moment, chewing on his own teeth, trying to figure out what his plan was here. Once again, he really wished he had a gun. And that didn't mean he was back to being an asshole, right? It's just that, well, guns are really nice to have when other things are trying to kill you. But just because he couldn't fire bullets didn't mean he had to be weaponless. Locked into the idea now, and maybe feeling a bit silly, he hustled around the corner to the east-facing side of the monastery. A door stood recessed into the side of the adobe wall just a few yards from the corner. He pushed into it and stood in blackness for a moment, wondering if his eyes would even adjust to this level of darkness. After a moment, he thought he detected the very dim outline of things. Hard to say, but he could smell the earthiness in that black room. Rust and dirt and grease and a planty smell that Bran associated with grass seed. This was where all the gardening tools were kept. He raised his hands and groped sightlessly until he felt the wall, then moved along it until his hand hit a solid hickory stave. Felt the top of it. A hoe. It could probably chop a skull, he thought, but he wanted something a little nastier. Knew there was a pitchfork in here somewhere. He felt along the tops of the tools until his fingers hit the tines of the pitchfork. They weren't really all that sharp, but they'd still stick a man, or a primal. He knew that last thought was stupid. If a primal got close enough for him to stab with a pitchfork, he was already fucked. But still, he felt better with something pointy in his hands. Moving out of the gardening shed, he closed the door behind him and stood, staring out into the eastern darkness. Maybe he should wake up Kat. Hell, she might not even be sleeping, even though there was no moon for the lunar princess to draw energy from. Yeah, it'd probably be wise to have her out here with him. He was essentially blind and poorly armed. She could see in the dark, hear much better than him, and would probably smell any trespassers coming long before they were close enough to be a problem. And she had claws and teeth. Toting his meager weapon of opportunity, Bran turned towards the corner and started back for the main entrance to the monastery. Then he stopped. Fuck it all. He'd just heard something, and he was far beyond doubting his senses at that point. He whipped around, looking into the black forest again. Something was moving through it, and not very stealthily. Hell, whoever or whatever it was apparently didn't give a shit about being heard. Twigs were snapping, wet leaves were sloshing, brush was thrashing. And Bran's heart was pounding. They were moving fast and making so much noise Bran couldn't even tell how many of them there were. Could have been one really loud bastard, or a dozen less noisy fuckers. Frozen with indecision. Run and get Kat, or stand and confront the intruder, or intruders, plural. Seemed stupid to confront what might have been several, but it seemed equally stupid to run, because by the time he got Kat up and they got back out here, whatever was in those woods would have made it inside the monastery. Bran gripped his pitchfork and leveled it at the darkness, taking a big breath to shout out a challenge. But right as he did, the noises stopped. Well, the crashing brush stopped, but Bran could swear he heard something breathing heavily, damn near gasping. It couldn't be primals, right? Primals weren't so loud, and he'd never seen one winded. Damn things could run for miles and never have to breathe through their mouths. Lungs still full, Bran wasn't sure why he didn't just shout, but he did speak in a harsh, loud whisper. Hey! Fuck off, motherfuckers! Not his best opening sally, but he was a bit short on imagination at the moment. Silence. Knees starting to tremble a bit, Bran shook the pitchfork as though that would frighten anything off. You turn your ass back around and get the fuck out of here, or I'm gonna stab the shit out of you! And then came a man's voice from the darkness, plaintive, scared, and breathless. I need help. Please, help me. Chapter 13. Damn it, Bran murmured to himself, then gave up on the pretense of not waking anyone and shouted, Who is that? How many are with you? Whoever it was, definitely a person and not a primal, shambled through the woods a bit more. It's Patrick! It's the guy you met the other day! It's just me! My team... He trailed off, almost like he decided he shouldn't say whatever he'd been about to say. So you're alone? Bran hollered at the darkness. Yeah, the voice groaned. The guy sounded worse than just winded. He sounded hurt. Unless this was some sort of ruse. Again, better to be paranoid. All right, Patrick, Bran said, hands wringing at the haft of the pitchfork. You stay right where you are. Don't come any closer. More thrashing brush. I can't fucking stay out here. Please. He's after me. I need to get inside.
Oh, hell. Who's after you?
Big Black! The one I shot the other day! He's after me!
Bran's brow beetled in confusion. That wasn't possible. The one he'd shot the other day was Elijah, and he was still laid up in bed. And Bran had thought he'd done a pretty good job of convincing this guy that it was him he'd shot. Apparently, the guy hadn't bought Bran's bullshit as much as he'd thought.
Please!
Patrick's voice wheedled.
Please help me!
Despite everything, the fact that this cock had put a bullet into Elijah, then had the gall to distrust Bran's bullshit cover story, and the fact that him being out in the woods in the middle of the night didn't make a lick of sense, Bran felt pity for the man. Just couldn't help himself. Because deep down inside, Bran had always been a sensitive soul. God, what if whatever was chasing this guy caught him and ripped him to shreds not 50 yards from where Bran stood? Could he live with that? Could he sleep with that man's dying caterwauls plastered all over his conscience? No, he could not. Okay, fuck it, Bran growled. Patrick, I want you to walk towards me. Slow, with your hands up. Not that that would make much of a difference, since Bran couldn't see shit. He heard the brush moving, and nearly at the same instant, Bran detected movement behind him. He jumped with a soft yelp, brandishing the pitchfork, only to spot the dim shapes of two figures running out from around the monastery's entrance.
Bran?
Shay's voice, riddled with worry.
What's going on?
I told Shad to tell you to stay locked up, Bran snapped, his eyes jagging back and forth between her approaching shape and the woods.
He told me,
Shay said, scuttling up to Bran.
But I heard voices.
Bran got a better look at the second figure accompanying Shay and realized it was Kat. Her face looked weirdly shadowed, until he realized that she donned her bandana to mask her face. Well, that was some good forethought on her part. Bran would never be the one to tell her to put it on, but he was glad she'd realized the need to hide her mutation from strangers.
Who is that?
Kat hissed, peering into the darkness and probably seeing a lot more than Bran could. The sound of brush had stopped, replaced with a soft swish of feet staggering through grass. Kat issued a low growl, like a dog that's seen something it doesn't like. It's okay, Bran said, though he didn't actually think it was. It's Patrick, the guy that shot Elijah. Shay recoiled.
How is that okay?
Kat's growl became more pronounced. Hey, cut that out. Bran nudged her, lowering his voice. You're gonna mask your face but still growl at the guy?
What's happening?
Shay demanded.
Is he coming towards us?
Yes, it's just him. Bran thought better of it. Kat, it's just him, right? She audibly sniffed the air.
Just him. But
what?
Others,
she said, her tone a warning.
Primals.
So it wasn't a ruse. The guy really was being chased by primals. And if they were close enough for Kat to smell, then they were far too close for Bran. Shay leaned in because the sounds of swishing feet were drawing closer, and Bran could just make out a shadowy shape moving towards them.
We can't let that asshole in here. He shot Elijah.
Remember, he shot me, Bran husked, turning to her. And are you really gonna leave the guy out here to become food? Do you really have that in you, Shay? Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But Bran was trusting that her distaste for violence extended to not wanting to see a gruesome death she could have prevented, because Bran sure as shit didn't want to see it. Shay lowered her voice even further, her breath brushing hot against Bran's ear.
Where are we gonna put him? The monastery's full of hybrids.
We don't have to keep him long, just until the threat passes. If the threat actually passed, and didn't just stick around to blow their doors in like the big bad wolf. Bran leaned around Shay and hissed to Kat, Go tell the others to stay hidden. Tell them to lock their doors and don't come out until I give the all clear. Kat's head swiveled, presumably to stare at him, and Bran figured the look would have been something like incredulity, but then she just grunted and spun around, running back into the monastery. The shape of the man named Patrick was now coalescing out of the gloom, and Bran could make out bare hints of his state, the way he hobbled along in a stiff, hitching gait. The guy was busted up, though Bran couldn't tell the extent of the injuries, not until he got some light. Shay, go and get a candle so we can see, Bran said, stepping out and raising the pointy end of his pitchfork away from the incoming man. And grab your medical stuff. Shay made a disconsolate noise but acquiesced, hustling off the way Kat had gone. Bran reached out a hand and stopped the man with a palm to his chest, electric tingles of adrenaline arcing through his limbs as he made contact with someone he didn't entirely trust, or really trust at all. But what was he going to do? He'd already decided he wasn't going to leave the sad bastard to his own fate. His conscience was already riddled with guilt tumors. Why let another one grow? "All right, stop," Bran ordered. The man's chest was heaving beneath Bran's palm, wet with sweat and rain. At least Bran hoped it was just sweat and rain. "Please," the man begged again, his voice much lower, pivoting his body partially to stare back the way he'd come. "Get me inside." "Do you have any weapons on you?" Bran demanded, his staying hand now frisking the guy's body, trying to see what he was equipped with. "I've got my rifle," the man said, "but no bullets for it. And I have a sidearm. It's only got a few rounds left in it." Bran felt what Patrick was talking about. A strap bisected his chest diagonally, and when Bran reached over his shoulder, he felt the cold kiss of gunmetal. He had the rifle slung on his back. Then Bran swiped a hand across his waist until he touched the holster. No sidearm in it. "I'm holding it," Patrick said. Bran froze, trying to find the man's hands in the dark. Was that the faintest glimmer of steel in his right hand? Bran's grip on the pitchfork tightened, wondering if he could jab the man with it one-handed if he needed to. "Pass it to me," Bran said, his tone hard, not looking for a debate. Patrick hesitated, but whatever was chasing after him must have concerned him a lot more, because Bran felt heavy steel and polymer fumble its way blindly into his hand. "Okay," Bran said, shoving the pistol into his pants pocket. "Now the rifle." Patrick hesitated with that one, like Bran had just asked to fondle his wife. Then he gave a growl, half impatience and half irritation, and gave the rifle up. Bran slung it over his shoulder, then looped an arm around the man. It was just kind of a natural movement to help someone he thought was wounded, but when he did it, he realized he expected Patrick to recoil from him. He was surprised when Patrick wilted into him. Did this guy actually trust him? Or was he just too hurt and scared to give a shit? "Come on," Bran said, hauling the man for the monastery's entrance. Where to put him? Not one of the dormitory rooms. Bran hadn't quite memorized who was staying in which rooms. He had a pretty good idea of where everyone was, but knew he couldn't afford a mistake, and with his heart pounding and his mind running in so many different directions, he didn't trust himself not to stumble into the wrong room and reveal one of the hybrids to Patrick, which he just assumed Patrick would have a strong negative reaction to. The kitchen, then. That's where Bran would take him. "The fuck were you doing in the woods at night?" Bran growled as he shuffled the man through the main entrance and into the corridor that ran around the courtyard. He kept glancing at the dark doors as he passed them, hoping to God that one of the boys wasn't sticking his head out to see what was going on. "Big Black hit one of our trading caravans," Patrick strained out. "Ambushed them on the road right near where I shot him a few days back." "You talking about when you shot me?" Bran said, remembering that he still had to stick with his previous subterfuge. Patrick didn't answer. "And who the fuck's Big Black? You've said that twice now." "It's the alpha male of a pack of infected," Patrick replied as they neared the door to the kitchen. Down the corridor a bit, Bran caught a twinkle of candlelight and saw Shay emerge from her room, lugging the bin of medical stuff on her hip and holding the tallow candle from her bedside. Bran hip-checked the kitchen door open and then paused, realizing he couldn't see shit inside. Needed to wait for Shay's light. "I've been hunting that bastard for years," Patrick continued. "He set an ambush for that trading caravan and ripped them all to hell. Took a bunch of the bodies, only left 2 alive. One of the ones he took was my man, one of my teammates, one of my trackers." "So you thought it'd be a good idea to go hunting him at night?" "Wasn't night when we started," Patrick snapped back. "I had a solid trail. I wasn't going to give it up. It's taken me years to find that motherfucker." "Yeah? Well, it doesn't sound like it worked out too well for you." Shay reached them, shouldering past and raising the candle to illuminate the room in muted yellows and flickering shadows. The kitchen was large, which Bran guessed was necessary to prepare meals for a platoon of monks. It had a big island in the middle, and Shay bustled to it, hiking the bin of medical equipment onto it and setting the candle there. "Put him on the island," she instructed. Bran took the man's rifle from where he'd slung it over his own shoulder and laid it against one of the kitchen cabinets, far out of reach of Patrick. Then he pulled the man to the island and helped muscle him onto it, laying him down as Patrick began to mule and sob. His voice came out choked. "They're all gone. My whole team. Big Black killed them all. I don't even think he had his pack with him. I think it was just him. And he fucking slaughtered us."
Who the hell is Big Black?
Shay demanded as they leaned the man back into a supine position on the island. In the candlelight, Bran recognized Patrick's face from their encounter a few days back, but Patrick was not a particularly remarkable man. Nothing really distinctive about him. Average height, average build, not muscular, but not thin. Sandy hair, cropped short, now dark with sweat. A short beard across his jaw. A forgettable face, except for the anguish in it and the fear in the man's eyes. Those pierced Bran pretty hard. Patrick looked at Shay.
"He's fucking massive. And..."
Hesitation, as though he just now realized Shay herself was black. Funny how social mores hang on, even in the most desperate times.
"I'm sorry. It's not racist. I wasn't the one that named him Big Black. It's just the name that people started calling him, and it stuck. He's very dark-skinned."
Oh, shit. Bran and Shay's eyes connected over top of Patrick's body. He watched realization ram its way through her confusion, shattering it into abject horror. Still holding Shay's stare, Bran said, "Yeah, I think we know who you're talking about." Shay's eyes jagged towards the open kitchen door.
"Bran, lock us in."
"Yup." Bran spun away and did as he was asked, and then did one better, snatching up a wooden chair and sliding it underneath the door handle to bolster their fortification. If Khan, or Big Black, was as massive as they made him out to be, Bran didn't think their defenses would hold for very long, but the chair might give them extra, priceless seconds. To do what? Bran's hand hit the pistol still in his pocket. He backpedaled away from the door, fumbling the weapon out of his pants. He tried to keep it hidden with his body, knowing Shay wouldn't like it, but he couldn't see what he was doing without the candlelight and was forced to turn towards it as he extracted the magazine and held it up to the light. Bran wasn't a weapons expert. He knew it was a semi-automatic pistol, and that was about it. Looked like a 9mm. 5 rounds left in the 15-round magazine. He seated it back in the pistol and press-checked the chamber. 1 more round in there. So 6 rounds total to defend against a beast that had taken down Patrick's entire team of hunters, who, Bran reminded himself, had sounded like they were packing plenty of heat, if the cavalcade of distant gunfire was any indicator.
"Where'd you get that?"
Shay demanded as Bran stuck the pistol back in his pants, this time seating it in the front of his waistband. "Patrick gave it to me," Bran said quickly, thinking he sounded like a kid that's been caught with a cigarette. Bran felt the overwhelming need to distract her, so he posted up on the opposite side of the island from Shay and looked down at the man lying between them. "Are you injured?" Patrick strained into a half-sit-up position, shaking hands covered in bits of dirt and forest detritus, reaching for his right leg. "Took a bad fall. Couldn't see shit when I took off running in the dark. Busted my knee." "Is it broken?" "I don't think so," Patrick said. "But I might have popped something. It feels like my old ACL injury." Hell, no wonder the poor bastard had made so much noise coming through the woods. He'd probably been dragging a useless right leg along with him. Bran was shocked that the man had even gotten away. Shay grimaced and shook her head.
"There's nothing I can do about that. Are you bleeding?"
She almost sounded hopeful. "No," Patrick grunted. "He never got a hold of me. Just the stupid fall I took. Do you have anything for the pain?" Bran thought of the bottle of tequila, which he knew was the best and only anesthetic they had, but he was not going back out there. Probably not until daylight, or until Khan came and killed them all.
"I'm sorry, we don't,"
Shay said.
"Best I can do is splint the knee to immobilize it."
"Fuck." Patrick's head wilted back, eyes pinched with pain. "Can I have some water?"
"That I can do,"
Shay said, sounding relieved, and spun for the pail of water beside the kitchen sink. A light rattling noise. Bran whirled towards the door, snatching the pistol clumsily out of his waistband, momentarily terrified that he would shoot his own dick off. Maybe he shouldn't have shoved it in the front. Once the muzzle cleared his pants and his manhood remained intact, his concern pivoted entirely to the door. Everyone